how that relates to leadership communication is it comes down to style. So if your style isn't recognizable, if it's not fitting within the comfort of the organization, then they're going to be less likely to really appreciate the value that you're bringing and provide you with the opportunities to ascend even further within the organization.
Hi everyone, I'm Barbara Bolt. Welcome to this episode of Confluence, where we explore communication at the boundary of language and culture. Today it's my pleasure to welcome my friend and fellow coach, Renee Walker, to the show. Renee, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to join you and your audience today.
Thanks so much. We're glad to have you. Renee is an award-winning brand marketing and communications executive. She honed her experience through executive positions with multi-million and billion-dollar brands in the private, public, and not-for-profit sectors. She launched Renee Walker and Associates, a strategy, brand, and marketing communications agency in 2012. Renee is the author of Brand Power for Small Business Entrepreneurs. She's also a Newsweek Expert Forum contributor, a featured contributor to various industry publications, and a national speaker on brand, leadership, and marketing. Renee and I served on a panel together last year for a networking group we're involved in, and she just blew me away with her in-depth knowledge of executive or leadership communication. I invited her here today to talk about the topic of how understanding an organization's culture impacts leadership communication. So without further ado, Renee, I will ask you the same question I ask all of my guests. Just tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and how you came to do what you do today.
Well, thank you so much, Barbara, for that very warm introduction. And honestly, I learned a lot from you on the panel as well. And I'm glad that we had an opportunity to do that. So a little about me, born and raised in the city of Detroit. I currently reside in West Bloomfield, Michigan in Oakland County, which is about 25 miles northwest of the city. I'm always going to be a Detroit girl at heart. I actually thought I was going to become a CPA, believe it or not. But I volunteered for a political campaign in my early 20s and was introduced to the war room and strategy and communications and absolutely loved it. So fast forward almost 30 years now or more, I had the great honor and privilege of working with amazing brands, learning the craft from the ground up. And more importantly, I get to marry the kind of analytical side of my brain with what I didn't realize I had was a creative side. So I'm super, super excited. Yesterday actually marked the 10th anniversary of my agency, Renee Walker and Associates. So I can't thank you so much. I cannot believe how fast it's gone by, but we're excited to continue pushing forward. So with that, the last thing I'll say is that communications for me is not just what I do, it's a passion. Organizations, leaders, when you have the ability to effectively, and what I like to say, strategically communicate, you have greater impact and ultimately the greatest opportunity to really empower those around you and help your organization succeed.
I agree so much with what you just said. And as you know, my niche is working with people whose first language is in English. And one of the reasons I wanted to have this conversation is because communicating like a leader is different than other kinds of communication. And it's more challenging no matter what language you're speaking. And even for people whose first language is English, leadership communication is often something people have to learn. So I hope today we can shed light on some of the things that help people understand how this type of communication is different and special and why it's worth investing energy in learning how to do it well.
Absolutely. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah. So the question that you and I mapped out together is this whole idea of how organizational culture impacts leadership communication in a particular organization. So could you explain that for us?
Absolutely. So every organization has values, processes, formal as well as informal. And what that really gets to the heart of is that the organization's culture is something that really guides all levels of decisions being made within the organization. So hiring, firing, promotion, opportunities, all of those things are a result of the organization's culture and, frankly, how well you fit within it, right? So,
So it's sort of like the how, right? It's all of those things are the what's, but then it's the how it's done
correct.
that is influenced by culture.
Correct. So when you go through
Got it.
hiring processes, particularly as you move up the ladder, a lot of the conversation is really about fit. Are you a fit for our organization? Are you a fit for our culture? As you ascend the ladder, the expectation is you have the record skills and talent required, but it comes down to, will you fit into our culture? Will you fit into our organization? Will you join our other leaders in how we lead our employees and our partners? And so from that perspective, that's why culture is very important in understanding the culture, because each organization is unique. And like, if you want to really be able to impact and deliver really outstanding results, you really have to sort of navigate the organization's culture. Oftentimes folks show up and believe, hey, I'm doing a really solid job. I'm like delivering some great results, but they're not recognized, or they might feel still that they're not part of the club, right? And so, go ahead.
Well, I just wondered, so that means they're not speaking the right language for that particular business culture.
Right. They're not reflecting the culture in a way that's being recognized. And so you want to pay attention to how decisions get made, as an example. Is it really the formal process that every organization has, or is there really an informal process that influences which of those two processes will be followed when decisions need to be made? Almost every organization now has a list of values and a mission statement and whatnot, and those are great. But how do they really live those values, and how does that mission really played out internally? It can often be different, and understanding kind of what those nuances are extremely important. And how that relates to leadership communication is, it comes down to style. So if your style isn't recognizable, if it's not fitting within the comfort of the organization, then they're going to be less likely to really appreciate the value that you're bringing and provide you with the opportunities to ascend even further within the organization. So you really have to become a member of the club. Now, I say that and I mean that, but you don't give up your authenticity. So the challenge with leadership communication is being authentically who you are, while also navigating and appreciating the culture in which you're working.
I think that's so interesting. And it's very interesting because you're talking about corporate culture. In my work, I talk about national culture often, which is, it's part of that organizational culture for sure. And it's that ability to code switch that is the trick, or the skill, I guess, that people learn. But I'm curious about what is it that leaders or people who want to be leaders in the organization need to tune into? You've said that a lot of this is quite nuanced. What are people looking for as they try to read this culture?
Sure. So the basic, first and foremost, the basic thing is, what type of culture is it? Is the organization innovative, meaning that they're early adopters and they take calculated risk? Like, no organization wants to just dump a ton of money and resources into something that has no shot, or it's not feasible. But if they're innovative, then they will definitely recognize that there could be some failure. They expect that to be minimized, but they ultimately expect that it is an ultimately calculated risk, but they will actually move forward. Then you have organizations that are more status quo. So they don't really move the needle one way or another. Once the water is safe, they sort of start to wade one way or another, but they're not going to be early adopters. So they're probably the middle of the pack. and the most rigid of organizations to be involved in is risk averse, which means that even given a ton of data and every opportunity to move forward, they're likely going to lag because they are fearful of failure, right? Whereas an innovative company or organization will embrace failure because they understand that's part of the growth process. But again, they want to mitigate it and they want it to be a calculated risk, not just let's wholesale go out there, right?
Risk.
So
if I'm sitting in a meeting in a company as an employee, I'm like observing how decisions get made, what the outcomes are. I mean, I guess if I were sitting in a meeting, I could identify if a company like punished someone for failing or
yes. You want to back up a little bit and you just want to understand holistically what is the culture of the organization. So how routinely do they operate? Are they usually leading edge? Are they usually sort of in the middle and they move once, there's been some work done in that space by peers and competitors? Or even given all that, they're most likely to still be lagging behind, even those who are status quo. So it's a totality of the organization. Like, how do they make decisions with respect to being in the marketplace? When are they bringing new services or products to the market? What does that process look like? What is the hiring process really like? Like, everybody has a checklist and they check all the boxes, but what are those other attributes? Like, are they really focused on cultural fit? Or are they more aligned toward wanting to bring people in who are going to have diverse opinions? So you really want to make sure you understand kind of how the organization functions and what their appetite is for change. Because if you're in a risk averse culture and you're highly innovative, then that is going to be a mismatch. So you can still manage that relationship, but you need to be cognizant of that, right?
For sure. Yeah, definitely. And I guess that would happen all the way back at the hiring process if all goes well, right? You'd get hired into a company that you feel comfortable in, which would then to me indicate that learning that style of communication wouldn't be so difficult. I think it would be harder for somebody who's mismatched. Yeah.
Absolutely. But even if it's a good cultural fit, making sure that you can be authentic in a way that's true to yourself and you're not diminishing your passion, your power, your ability to empower your employees. So it comes down to really understanding, again, how are decisions made? Who are the influencers? What is their currency, right? These are all the questions you want to know. So once you know what the organization's type is, it's innovative, status quo, or risk averse, then you want to start looking at the leaders. Who actually can get things done? Who can have an idea and all of a sudden we're like moving forward on it? Where are the obstacles? What is their currency? So there's an entire conversation to be had around what's known as influence mapping. Right. So you want to understand who the players are. You want to understand what they care about most. You want to understand kind of what they value most. And using all of that information gives you a much better playbook on how to be authentic within that particular culture.
So that tells you who you need to influence and maybe there's something specific about their style that you need to tune into or mimic. Is mimicking ever a good idea?
I don't think so. I think what you want to do is understand who they are, and you have to build a team, right? You need supporters. So when you look at influence map and whatnot, you will have promoters, people who are really good cheerleaders. So if your ideal is starting to move, you want them on board because they can get you further down the field. You want champions, people who actually have the ability to influence senior leadership or the executive team so that your ideal can actually be considered, right? Then you have those who are bystanders. They don't hurt you or they don't harm you. It's just good to know who they are. And then finally, they're clogs. And those are individuals who are either by position or personality or title could potentially derail your move forward, your idea, your project or whatever not. So you really have to understand the various personalities engaged in the final decisions and then be
For
able to
sure.
build a team that supports you as you move forward with the organization.
So you need your people who promote you, and then you need to know who your detractors might be.
Mm-hmm.
You don't necessarily want them on your team. Yeah, it's strategic, isn't it? It's like Peyton Place, or I mean, that's an antique phrase, I guess, these days. But it's that
Yeah.
you've got to know the environment and the players
Mm-hmm.
in order to know who to communicate with,
Mm-hmm.
not only what to say to them.
Exactly. And, it's no different than if you're, trying to market a product or service. Your brand needs to be, you need to invest in your brand. It needs to be authentic. It needs to fit within the culture. You can navigate that. Even if you're mismatched, you can still navigate it. It takes a much more work, but you can do it. But what's really important is understanding your audience and understanding what
Mm.
they care about. So when you're going through and trying to determine all of this, right, you start small, you really observe a lot, you listen intently, actively, so that you're understanding how things are phrased, what people care
Yeah.
about, what their priorities are. So when you're having have the opportunity to have conversations with them, you can meet them where they are. And that's no different than any other communication application that you would do, right? Whether it's internal, external, marketing, advertising, sales, whatever it is. It's the same principle, but it's just brought down to a more personal level.
Yeah, I think one of the most important things is listening to what people say and the words they use as they speak about something, whatever it is, if it's a product, if it's a concept, and then being sure in your response or when you talk about that you're using similar language
Mm-hmm.
so that it twigs with them, because people are typically using language that they value or that makes sense to them anyway. And by being sure to use that language in your way of speaking about whatever it is, I think they are more likely to hear you.
100%. 100%. Exactly.
Yeah. And it can take effort. Your point about authenticity, I think, is an important one, because some people always want to just be themselves. And it's important to be yourself. I totally get that. But when I was teaching a lot of intercultural communication, I would sometimes say just being yourself isn't going to be enough in this situation. And I do think there's, obviously, if somebody has to put themselves in a position of being uncomfortable all the time, every day, it's not a good situation. But sometimes in order to get our message across, we have to make that little bit of extra effort to maybe use vocabulary that we wouldn't normally use, or, whatever it is, so that we're sure that we get the result we need.
Mm-hmm.
So would you agree that short-term discomfort is an okay thing in this, when we talk about leadership communication?
Absolutely. It's a growth process, right? Every situation is different. There are a lot of nuances. You won't necessarily always get it 100% right, but that's okay. There shouldn't ever be a situation that you shouldn't be able to recover from. You just
Mm-hmm.
want to make sure that you're really honing in on the things that are important and understand who the key players are. Look, at the end of the day, organizational culture is about the people, right? It's
Yeah.
not about the processes. It's not about the technology. It's about the people. And so
Mm-hmm.
when you can recognize that and hone in on that, you have a much better opportunity to really focus in on what's important and cut all the noise out, because there's a lot of noise in this process.
Yeah.
Companies will suggest this is our culture, and it really isn't, right? If you actually were to work there, you'd know that that's not it. So they sometimes struggle with their own authenticity. So that's one of the reasons you shouldn't mimic. One, people don't appreciate it. You lose all credibility. It damages your reputation, and it frankly unnecessarily places obstacles in your way of empowering and building your team and those allies that you need throughout the organization. My first manager actually in the 80s was a woman who had worked her way up through corporate, when women in director level positions or just beyond were very difficult. Like that was difficult to achieve back then.
Mm-hmm.
And her method of doing that was essentially to mimic the men, right? So there was a barbershop. We were at the world headquarters. There was a barbershop located on the first floor, and that's where she got her haircut. Like she's one of the guys. right?
Wow,
Oh, right, 100%.
that's amazing.
And as a result of that, while she was able to continue to move up the ladder, she ultimately got stuck at director,
Mm,
because it just didn't work well. She wasn't seen in the proper light, right?
I
And
see.
so that's why mimicking doesn't work. When I say understand and navigate the culture, it is that understand the culture and figure out how to navigate it authentically for you, and to also be able to build those relationships that you need. And that's where the communication comes in. Sometimes, to your point, you have to adjust your leadership or your communication style. It's, you want to make sure that you're seen as a part of the club, like they see
Right,
you as an ally, that they see you as part of the group, a part of the team.
right.
Oftentimes what you'll hear is, oh, well, you're really not part of the team or whatever, right? That's why sometimes leadership communications is as much about how you speak as how you
Hmm.
show up and how you carry yourself. So, New York University in 2011 did a study where they looked at what happens when we see one another. And what they determined is that we make 11 major decisions about each other in the first 7 seconds. Now, this is before you've opened your mouth and said hello or greeted the room. It's before you've taken a seat at the table or whatever not. And so, what I always tell my clients is control the first 7 seconds,
Oh, yeah,
because
definitely.
that's the narrative by which everybody is going to hear whatever your contribution is. So they're deciding, for example, are you approachable? Are you intelligent? Are you respectable? Are you credible? I mean, these are pretty fundamental things we do to one another as humans. And if you don't understand and control that first 7 seconds, you're missing an opportunity to also frame the filter by which they're going to hear your comments throughout the conversation.
Right, because if you don't get that first 7 seconds right in their mind, I mean, it's their judgment. So you don't even know what you're trying to influence, what might be credible to them, or what might be one of those other attributes. So yeah, definitely, I've always taught the same thing, that you've got to make that good first impression, because it's hard to undo it.
Correct.
It's very
And it should be
difficult.
authentic. So.
Right. Yeah, it definitely should be authentic. Can you share just a few tips that might help our audience to enhance their leadership communication skills?
Sure. So I would say, you definitely want to work on what's known as executive presence, right? We all
Mhm.
know those single name celebs and athletes that you only need to know their first name and you know exactly who everybody's talking about. Well, that's great. But in this scenario, what I'm suggesting is you want to make sure that you show up authentically and you want to show up as a leader. And
Mhm.
so that means that attire is important. Your ability to speak truth to power is important. Your ability to empower your teams. So oftentimes I think leaders fail the majority of the time on communication because they're talking at people, not with people, and not to people, and not empowering their teams. If you take
Mhm.
care of your team, they'll take care of you. And if you uplift your team from just being authentic and engaged and empowering them, then that will uplift all of the opportunity for results, and it will put you in a much better position in terms of how your leadership style is interpreted throughout the organization. The final
Mhm.
thing to remember is you want to absolutely be mindful of what you're bringing into any conversation in any room, and you want to control that. So again, it
Mhm.
goes back to, yes, control the first 7 seconds, but whatever that brand is that you have and that you've built, you want to make sure that you continuously live up to it. So that's email communication. It's how you speak to your team. It's how you de-escalate conflict. It's how you manage your team. So leadership communication is more than simply sending out a memo or having a single one-on-one conversation. It's the totality of all that you do that defines who you are as a leader. And I'll tell you, Barbara, most executives, as they are, moving up and ascending the ladder and whatnot, don't really focus on their executive brand, which is
Mm.
what I'm talking about. So,
Mm-hmm.
you have to represent that part of your brand as much as you represent your personal brand.
Sort of like in every moment, you have to be cognizant. I mean, as a business owner, we talk about being on message,
Mm-hmm.
right? And it's that really.
Yes.
And I think it sounds kind of terrible to say, but not letting your guard down, because you never know who's listening and you never know who's watching and who might be that person who passes something on to another person that they witness or they hear. And I do think people take that for granted. It's not, it seems like, 24/7 on is another phrase that we use. And when you're at work, I think to some degree, especially if you have leadership ambitions, you have to operate in that way. You're on while you're in that environment. And
yeah, absolutely. A college women's basketball coach once shared with me that she had an opportunity to promote somebody within the team because there was someone who had moved on to another position at another university, had been promoted and whatnot. And as she looked around, what she realized was the person that she ultimately selected just got it done. Like they
mm-hmm.
were, definitely engaged. They just were doing what was necessary to improve the team, to make sure their part was being handled so that the entire team could be successful.
Mm-hmm.
And another young lady came to her and asked why she did not receive the opportunity. And she
Mm-hmm.
told her, because you don't show up, right? You're not contributing to the team. You just have it's a job. You're checking a box.
Right.
Right. She observed her without her knowledge. She just simply went about her day, and she kept noticing things that weren't necessarily bad, but she wasn't giving it her all. She wasn't
Right.
putting in 100% effort. And as a result of that, she did coach her, and ultimately she was promoted into another role. But, that's just the lesson learned. People are always watching you, particularly when you're a leader. And
Right.
that's just part of the responsibility and the opportunity, right? And the higher you go up, the more eyes that are on you. So you shouldn't shy away from leadership. You should develop your communication skills, nonverbal, verbal, your attire, all of it. But just recognize that it's honestly a privilege as you move up to be able to inspire and hopefully empower so many people within the organization.
Yeah, I would definitely say that's a privilege. I think power can be interpreted in different ways, but and people I think tend maybe to think about the money. However, when you think about the influence
Mm-hmm.
that you gain as you go up the ladder, that to me, that would be where it's at. That would be the more
100%. And for
exciting.
women, it's even more important that we are intentional and purposeful
Mm-hmm.
in how we show up.
Yeah, that intentionality word. I love that word. I use it all the time in my work. It's that acting like you mean it, no matter what it is that you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything else you'd like to share as a parting shot, or is that kind of it for
Well,
tips?
I would just sum it up by saying be who you are, be authentic to who you are, understand how to navigate the organization based on its culture. Definitely figure out who are the promoters, the champions, the bystanders, and the clogs. That intel is very, very crucial to being able to kind of map out like how you can more engage and be accepted within the organization, and then recognize culture comes down to the people. And so
Yeah.
I'm an introvert, and most people don't believe that, but it's true. And all that really means is that how I recharge is with quiet, where
Mm,
extroverts are people who really enjoy people. So if like through the pandemic and the lockdowns and the remote work and all of that, extroverts have had a really challenging time because they haven't had access to the same level of people that they normally enjoy. But
right.
for an introvert, it was nothing new for us, right? So,
It was fun.
and so what I would say is just recognize that those labels, you should know yourself, you should know what you're bringing into the environment, but you should not allow any of it to stop you from excelling.
Yeah, I would agree totally. Especially, introverts can turn it on when they need to. And then, as you know, because you are one, recuperate. They have to recuperate their energy. But yeah, absolutely. Well, I really appreciate these insights, Renee, and I'm sure our audience will as well. Thank you very much for joining. How can people get a hold of you? Why don't you share your contact information?
Sure. My website is ReneeWalkerandAssociates.com, and my phone number is 248-671-3872. And Barbara, thank you so much for having me. I've really appreciated the conversation today, and I hope your audience can gain some insights that are helpful and valuable as they continue to move forward in their leadership journey.
Thank you so much. And we got it from a real expert today. So I very much appreciate your being with us today. Before we sign off, I'd just like to say to the audience, thank you so much for tuning in. We always appreciate the eyes on the show. If you enjoyed it, please give it a like and consider subscribing to the channel. If you'd like to help in improving your leadership communication skills, particularly if you're a non-native English speaker, head on over to boldglobal.com and book a free consultation. I'd be happy to listen to you and give you some feedback. Ci vediamo la prossima volta. We'll see you next time.